start first?
Sure.
Well, welcome everybody. It's always good to see a full house. No past, no future. I am Benny Chia. 33 years ago, I started this place with the help of a group of volunteers, and I'm still here after 33 years. And the reason why I'm still here is because I can, well, first, meet remarkable people, such as Kevin, and also I'm able to dream up, creative things and turn them into realities. Now, before I let Kevin talk, I must, put things in context because not that many of you know I'm part Singaporean. Now, I was born in Singapore and raised up in Hong Kong. So you can call me a Singaporean honky. And when I come to think of Singapore, it's a place that is made of memories, my own memories and my mother's stories, and also my imagination. And I always think of Singapore and Hong Kong in that context. So in our dialogue, you may find me sometimes critical of Singapore, but I think I'm entitled to, because I'm looking at Singapore as also the place that I feel very dear about and very strongly about. Now, Kevin, it's such a wonderful experience to meet Kevin, because it's an encounter that you make only through friends and a like-minded friend. And Kevin is a professor of law. He's also keen on heritage conservation, and he's also a keen music writer and critic. Now, I don't think we can indulge him in his hobby today, because we want him to talk about heritage conservation and also his views about Hong Kong from a legal point of view. Now, I also like to introduce Ming, who's been with Kevin and come specially to support him, and some of your friends here.
Yeah.
You talk about
Yeah.
who has taken this photo later. Okay. Now, if I may, I also like to talk a little bit about my impression of Singapore. I think of Singapore, if I have to distill down to three things. First, what my mother used to tell me, that is a place that during the day is very hot, and in the evening then comes the evening drizzle. And she used to talk about after dinner, then she would take us to sit fong. So it's a term that used in Singapore only. That is the other memory I have of Singapore is a little bit of the supernatural, which brings me to maybe later, let Kevin talk about the cemetery and Bukit Brown. Now, my mother has this story about this two teenagers, who very much together, and they used to wander the hills, and they would just pick wild pineapples and eat them. But because they ate so much of wild pineapples, they finally got some kind of a deadly illness, and they die of it. And then That's the story that my mother told me, because she wanted me to beware of eating too much tropical food. and the story goes like, then after this, two teenagers died. They kept awake, 7 nights after they died, and they were in this room, and they were playing mahjong, and then suddenly the light turned from yellow to blue, and everybody knew that the two lost souls came back to pay the last visit to this group of friends. So I combined pineapple and lost soul together, and Singapore. But my last story, quite recent. A few years ago, when Hong Kong tried to demolish Queen's Pier, at that time I had some interns from Singapore, and we gave them a Hong Kong experience. So what we did was, we took them to Queen's Pier, near Star Ferry. There was a demonstration going on, and then at the same time we gave them chewing gum. And so they were watching a demonstration and chew gum, and afterwards they told us that that's the most exciting experience for them. Okay, so I'll pass it on to Kevin.
Great. Thank you very much, Benny, thank you very much for inviting me to the Fringe Club. I've been to Hong Kong many times, but I must confess this is absolutely the first time I've been inside the Fringe Club. The closest I last was actually next door at the Foreign Correspondents Club. So I'm really glad I finally made it in here. And thank you all for coming. Maybe I should start by saying a little bit about myself in the way that Benny has been telling you some stories. I must confess I've never heard this pineapple story before. So maybe my mother was not afraid that I eat too much tropical fruit. But talking about the sek fong, this is actually comes from a Malay expression, makan angin, meaning eating air, literally. Which is if you sit by the seaside and you open your mouth, it's free. So eating air is free and it's pleasurable, with the sea breeze and so on. My day job is as a law professor. I teach at the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore, and my specialty is in constitutional and administrative law and human rights and all the stuff that doesn't make any money in Singapore, right? At least from the legal perspective. But outside of my day job, I also am quite active in a number of organizations. I used to be very active a long time ago in the Boy Scout movement. I then was quite active, as sort of a political activist, in the sense that we set up an NGO in Singapore to talk only about politics, which in the 1990s was unheard of. It was called the Round Table, and I was president of that for a couple of years. We shut down the Round Table after about 10 years because we got a bit tired of talking to each other. So we thought, go talk to other people. And although I had always been a very keen student of history, I never was really part of the sort of heritage crowd until I had stepped down as president of the Round Table. And two of my good friends, one architect, William Lim, and the other one, sociologist Kwok Kian Woon, each twisted one of my arms and made me agree to become the president of the Heritage Society. And this is the irony, because they tell you there's no such thing as a free lunch. Well, it was worse than that, because I ended up paying for lunch, and I was there for 10 years as the president of Heritage Society. Currently, I stepped down as president in 2011, and in the last few years, I've been president of the Singapore chapter of ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, which is the sort of the technical arm for UNESCO. So if you're looking at inscription of World Heritage Sites and so on, UNESCO relies on the professionals who are in ICOMOS. So it's not an open organization in the sense that you have to be sort of in a related heritage industry to be able to be a member of ICOMOS. So that's basically sort of background where I come from. The music stuff is just fun, and that's how in a way we were introduced to each other because of a mutual friend, Pang Ming Yen. I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to say. I thought this is going to be a dialogue, so now I'll say a little bit about some of the interesting things I'm doing. And I know by Hong Kong standards that the kind of activism that we take part in and we do in Singapore look like child's play, because we don't chain ourselves to pillars, and we don't have occupy Fullerton Square or something like that. And I'll tell you why. Largely because it doesn't work. And in Singapore, we are all kind of very, very practical people. So we try and find ways to get the government to change its mind in ways that would work rather than things that don't work. And petitions don't work. I can assure you, I've collected thousands of petitions. They don't work. So no more petitions. No point collecting petitions. My main advocacy work in the last 15 years, I would say, has largely been in the field of heritage. The picture you see here is an aerial photograph of the largest tomb in a cemetery in Singapore called Bukit Brown. Bukit means hill, Brown, of course, is the name of the Englishman who used to own an estate there, and of course it's just named after him. Right? It's called Bukit Brown Cemetery. Actually, it comprises a couple of cemeteries, one which belongs to the Ong clan, one is called the Old Cemetery, and one's called the Coffee Hill Cemetery. But basically, there are about 4 cemeteries built into one. We think, of course, in advocacy terms, it's always good to have something superlative. We think it's the largest Chinese cemetery outside of China. Right? So when we go up and we tell the government that they should not destroy it and so on and so forth, at least there's something superlative. Because Singapore, if you don't know this by now, Singaporeans and Singapore government like to be number one in everything. Right? So you want to be the biggest, the best. So you tell them this is the biggest cemetery, so you better not destroy it, otherwise we will not have the title anymore. So what are the kind of things that we do? This is, of course, I must confess, and actually the person who knows more about Bukit Brown Cemetery than anybody I know, really, is sitting here in this room, is my good friend, Dr. Hui Yu Feng. Yu Feng, could you maybe just stand up? Yeah, this photograph actually comes from Yu Feng, which was shot using a balloon, actually a helium gas balloon with a fisheye lens. And it's the largest tomb in the cemetery of over 100,000 tombs. Right?
Maybe outside of China.
Yes. Sorry?
Maybe outside of China is the largest.
It's outside of China, the largest.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why I say outside China, right? The largest outside China, not largest Chinese cemetery. And I must say, even though we use this photograph, my role in the advocacy relating to Bukit Brown actually is quite a small one. This was in the dying days of my last term as president of the Heritage Society. And I got a call one morning from the Chief Executive of the Land Transport Authority and the Chief Executive of the National Parks Board. Now these are the 2 agencies that were most pertinent in this particular case. Why the Land Transport Authority? Because they wanted to exhume some 4,000 graves to build a highway right across the cemetery, one part of it. So Land Transport Authority comes in, and the National Parks Board, believe it or not, is supposed to be a parks board, but they are also in charge of the cemeteries. So I got a call one morning to have breakfast with the 2 of them. Quite obviously, it wasn't a very appetizing breakfast, because all they wanted to do was to tell me that we thought we should let you know that tomorrow we will announce that we're going to build a highway through Bukit Brown Cemetery. This is typical style of civil society encounters in Singapore. I must say, it is changing in some ways, but in some ways this is typical old stuff. Right? I'll tell you the day before. Don't say I didn't tell you, I told you before. But it's like yesterday, right? What can I do? I mean, 24 hours is nothing you can do anyway. But it was a little bit different because they kind of expected me to react violently. No, I mean not punch them in the face. I mean I can't know these guys, right? I mean, not violently in the sense that they expected me to be very, very vehement in my protests about this, and I was very firm. I said, look here, how can you make an announcement about what's going to happen tomorrow? What do you expect me to do? I don't even have time to talk to my exco. I don't even have time to talk to my members. There's no consultation. What do you want me to do? And they just sort of looked down and said, well, we thought you should know. Okay, I had to do some serious quick thinking there. I mean, we could say, all right, now I know I can go home, because I can't change anything. It's going to be gazetted the next day. It's done deal, right? And I thought, okay, I could end this now and take off and show my displeasure, but only 2 people will know how angry I am. Not much point. So I thought I'd extract something from them. And I said, well, before you do any exhumation, you must comply with the highest standards of heritage documentation and conservation. Meaning, you can't keep things. Okay, if you're going to exhume, you're going to exhume. But before you exhume, we want proper documentation. These 2 guys suddenly lit up. They were like so relieved. Oh, you mean that's all you want? And I said, yes, right? And you will pay for it. Oh, no problem, we'll pay for everything, right? You let us know what the budget is, everything, no problem. And that was when I said, and you need somebody who knows about anthropology, somebody who knows about sociology and about exhumation of cemeteries to lead the job. And that's when I suggested that you folk would do the job. And I'm glad that he did. It was, 2 years? Almost, right? Yeah. Quite a tough job, I must say. And Singapore is hot, it's like Hong Kong now. And in the cemetery, I can assure you, it's much hotter. So it's quite backbreaking work. My job was very, very small, but I did tell these 2 gentlemen, these senior civil servants. I said, look, why are you only just talking to me, the Singapore Heritage Society? There are many, many other people out there who are going to be much more angry than I am. And they didn't believe me. They said, oh, come on, who's interested in cemeteries? Right? Which in a way is quite true, because a little time before this, I had done a book called Spaces of the Dead. The book took 10 years to materialize. It started with the exhumation of another cemetery called Bidadari in 2001. And at that time, we couldn't do much about it. We thought what we could do is to get people who are interested in cemeteries to come together. Thank you, Catherine. This is the book that took 10 years to come out. It's called Spaces of the Dead. And I wrote the introductory chapter called The Death of Cemeteries in Singapore. We held a little conference. We pulled together people interested in cemeteries, and quite honestly, at that point in time, the person who actually wrote the chapter on Bukit Bram, this cemetery, was a South African, a lady called Elizabeth Mackenzie. And she didn't read Chinese. She always went around with the help of a translator. She was documenting things when nobody was interested. She fell into, I don't know how many rotten graves. You have to experience this to know. I think, yeah, you walk and then suddenly the foot goes in and then, ooh. It went through somebody's rotten coffin, right? So Liz Mackenzie was the one who did this. So really, there weren't many people interested in cemeteries. Singaporeans generally were not interested in cemeteries. So the 2 civil servants weren't completely wrong. They thought, well, sure, who's going to be interested? Only you crazy heritage guys, right? And I said, no, you don't forget, right? Something about heritage, everybody has a grandfather. My only point being not that everybody has a grandfather in Bukit Bram, it's just that everybody has a past, everybody has family, and there are connections. And the thing blew up in their faces. It did blow up in their faces. They did not expect people to get angry. They were always puzzled, why are people so angry? It's just a cemetery. Well, I said, well, in the past, yes. But there is something going on in Singapore. And here, we see this happening not just in Singapore, but in other parts of the world, and probably in Hong Kong as well. And that this is, in a way, a a post-materialist kind of attitude which infuses many of our young people. We have young people now who are not just out there to try and chase the dollar. Of course, they still do, but there are many who are actually interested in things like that. And so the most active people there were actually the young ones who were very interested, and they were very good at using social media and so on, and pulling things together. So, my role in this was actually quite small, but I just wanted to use this as a starting point for talking about this, and maybe just to finish off on this before we carry on the dialogue. This book took 10 years to, and it feeds into that point, who's interested. The essays were all finished within 2 years. By 2003, I had the final draft of this book. I couldn't find anybody to give me money to print this book. Because, I mean, I'm not fantastic at raising funds, but I can raise funds. But every time I go to my friends in the bank and so on, they say, yeah, cemetery, please don't talk to me about cemetery, okay? Anything else but cemeteries. It's dead people's story, right? In Singapore, there's a Malay word called pantang. That means you have a bad omen. I think it's very, very, choi cái đây don't say, So, it's that kind of attitude. So it took me a long time. You won't believe the kind of people I had to persuade. I even persuaded my acupuncturist to give money for this. Anyway, finally we raised enough money, and then this is the last bit, right? The book launch was on Saturday, and the books were supposed to be delivered on the morning of Thursday. So I sat at the publishers waiting for the book to arrive. And I was waiting the whole day, and then whole morning, nothing happened. We said, okay, then maybe later we go for lunch, came back. No books arrived, and finally at 4:30, this poor printer came in, right? He said, hey, Michael, his name is Michael. I said, Michael, what happened to you? We waited for you whole day. He said, you won't believe this. He said, we couldn't get it out on time to deliver this morning. I said, why? He said, my workers, they said this book, they're not printing it at night, They're only printing it in the daytime. So that's why there was this delay. So anyway, the book is out, and suddenly you had a group of people who suddenly felt that their idea of being a part of Singapore, the idea of belonging to a country, a nation like Singapore, had to do with some of these memories, some of these intangible things that link them to the space. I'm sure all of you know, we always talk about this. You go to every city around the world, every shopping center looks the same. Everyone has the same shop. So what is it that links us back to our roots, to where we are? That's why I had the title, No Past, No Future. If you don't know where you come from, what is it that links you to a space, then I think there's really no future for that nation. So let me stop there, Benny, with that little introduction. And I don't know where we're going from here.
Well, this is called Naked Dialogue. The reason why we call it Naked Dialogue is we hope that we can get into a conversation, no holds barred. Now, coming from the Singapore context, maybe it's a little bit difficult to go into certain topic that we can talk very freely about. But Kevin's promised me that he can be really open on topics such as what we talked about in our conversation, in order to find something to talk about in this dialogue. That is, you said when you deal with a government like the Singaporean government, you know civil action doesn't work, but you still persist in doing what you feel is right, and even though you know that you can't win, but you try and make it as painful as possible, for the government. Now, can you elaborate on that?
Sure. I think when you live in a place like Singapore, and for those of you who don't know much about Singapore other than the fact that we've banned the import of chewing gum. You can chew gum in Singapore, you just can't buy it, that's the problem, right? So if you can't buy it, then how you chew it? I mean, I tell you what happens. Singaporeans go to Johor, Malaysia, and buy it and come back and chew, right? And since you don't, you buy for personal consumption, that's not importation. But anyway, the reality is this. Singapore is a city-state that's we are kind of smaller than Hong Kong in terms of population. There are 5.5 million people, 3.8 are citizens, the rest are not. Many of them are transients, foreign workers, and so on. And there has only been one political party in power since 1959. That's the People's Action Party. They have been there for so long that I think you have to recognize the reality that it is highly unlikely that they are going to be worried about some kind of political opposition. Okay? Why is that? They have habitually won their elections by very, very large margins. Even after 2011, 2011 was what we considered to be a major watershed election. And in that election, out of 86 seats, they lost 7. So they lost less than 10% of the seats. And that was considered a great cause of celebration all around in Singapore, right? Of course, they thought it was a disaster. The People's Action Party thought it was a disaster, and so they went away, licked their wounds, actually worked really, really hard and came back and won back a couple of seats. So you're not going to be able to they are not afraid of political opposition because the political opposition is very, very weak. And besides, there's no ideology in politics in Singapore. They are all things to all people. If the government, if you want to ask if the government is capitalist, yes, they're capitalists. Are they socialists? Also socialists. They have no. They're not fixated on any ideology. They're happy to steal anybody's idea. If you're an opposition, you have a good idea, they say, yeah, that's a good idea, they take it and then they implement. Then you knock out the opposition really, right? You don't need those guys. You just give me ideas, I implement, there's no shame about this, right? And actually that works to our advantage because one of the things that we try to do is that we make them think it's their idea. In some of these things that we try to do at the civil society level. So if you give them the idea that they think it's theirs, after a little while, they start to own it. And then you get changed. Doesn't matter who gets credit. I'll give you an example. Changi Prison was a prison that was built in 1930. It was finished about 1930. At that time, the most modern prison in Asia. In the 1990s, they decided that this prison was way too old and too small. They needed a new prison complex. And for security reasons, they wanted to build the prison sort of semi-underground rather than all above ground, right? And the only site available was the old Changi Prison. So they decided that they would tear everything down. Those of us in the heritage field said, look here, you should at least keep something for people to remember that this was where Changi Prison was. And so you should, well, by the way, the new one is also called Changi Prison. So, but you should keep at least one wall, right? And they had 4 walls, and we said, let's keep the shortest one wall. No budging. Even the Heritage Board thought that we should keep one wall, but the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is much more powerful ministry, said, nothing doing. After 4 years of going back and forth, they said, okay, we'll let you have 2 turrets. So 2 turrets, no wall. This is the most postmodernist prison I've ever heard of, right? No 2 turrets, no wall, right? And of course, we were desperate, couldn't do anything about it. Someone came out with the idea, in fact it was an insider, said, hey, the Australians feel very strongly about Changi Prison. We should let them know that Changi Prison is about to be demolished. So we checked the newspapers to make sure that actually it's been stated somewhere that Changi was about to be demolished, and then we sort of let the Australians know. Australians have some real deep attachment to Changi. Okay, every year our World War II ceremonies, the Australians will come in full force. Grandchildren of people who used to be locked up in Changi prison. And so they took it up through their minister in charge of veterans, all the way to their foreign ministry. And then they said, well, at that time, actually, we were just lucky because the foreign minister was Alexander Downer. And Alexander Downer's father had actually been locked up in Changi. So he said, no, it doesn't belong to Singapore alone. Changi is, heritage of, mankind. It's not just Singapore. You can't just go around knocking it down. So this whole thing went back and forth, back and forth. In the end, it went up because, and again, we were lucky because at the time, Singapore government was deep in negotiations with Australia for a free trade agreement. So, okay, maybe this is something that might be put on the agenda. In any case, compromise was reached. The original idea to keep one wall, turrets, gate and all was accepted. But they were very unhappy with it. They kept the wall, but then they put a fence around it. They use it as a car park. Then suddenly, last year, they declared it a national monument. In the celebration of, I forget what anniversary, the prison authorities said, oh, this is our heritage. And it became a national monument. Suddenly the fences are coming down. They made an announcement that they're going to build a garden around the front of this wall to make it more accessible to the public. Suddenly, of course, it's all the idea, right? So this is one sort of strategy that you can use to positive effect.
So something about Changi Prison. The Australian film industry and television, they actually profit from it. It's the place where the Japanese kept the POW there, and it was very brutal. Memories very bad, but the Australians just love that kind of memories.
Actually, it's a faulty memory because the Australian troops mainly were actually in the military barracks called Selarang Barracks, which is just outside of the prison. They were never inside the prison, but for some reason they all thought they were inside the prison. It felt like that, So anyway, it is a faulty memory and appropriation of a particular type of history, but who cares?
And Singapore also has built the airport there. So the Changi Airport now has a different set of memories, for visitors to Singapore. Nothing to do with the Changi prison. Right, Kevin. We talk a little bit about Singapore government has made it not viable for civil action. Because PAP it may as well be Lee Kuan Yew's idea to make Singapore a place that its citizen interests are well taken care of. So according to Chinese society, 衣食住行, so the clothes that you wear, food you eat, and so on and so forth. Especially living quarters. They know how important it is, for a city to feel contented. Singapore government has done something which is so vital for a sense of well-being and security, and we can't say the same for Hong Kong, unfortunately, because I think many of us living here feel that there's a lot of there's a sense of insecurity here, which may have stemmed from housing, for instance, because it's getting so expensive, and a lot of young people feel that it's quite hopeless to make Hong Kong home because they cannot afford to buy a flat here. Now, that may or may not be a problem in Singapore, but for many years, the PAP has made sure that people are well taken care of in the material or materialistic ways. Now that you have heard about the despair of Hong Kong, now if you have to choose, say either staying in Singapore or immigrating to Hong Kong, is that an option for you?
Is it an option for me? At this age, maybe not. But no, I'm quite serious. I'm half joking only. I mean, I think if I were younger, prospects in Hong Kong, the excitement in Hong Kong may be more interesting. But at this age, probably too exciting for me. But I mean, to be a little bit more serious about this, we discussed this quite a lot actually about the problem of housing, and actually Singapore, we kind of take some of these things for granted. That and that's why I mentioned just now that the government, if you want to call them socialists, they are also socialists. They are socialists in some ways, and the reason they were socialists was because they started out as a socialist party. They were what they call socialist democrats, right? And the major plank of their program, which gave them the legitimacy in the earliest years, was in public housing. Now, Singapore was very much like Hong Kong in the 1950s, in a way pretty much on parallel, in the sense that the colonial authorities did not provide much public housing. They did some, but it was miserable, right? In something like 40 years, they built 20,000 units, which was way, too few for the burgeoning population. The PAP came in, and this was the first thing they did. I mean, there was a slogan, we've got to break the back of the housing problem and so on. And to do this, actually, they couldn't use, they knew it wouldn't work to use the old civil servants who were part of the British regime. And what they did was they brought in a businessman. The businessman was a man called Lim Kim Sang. He had made millions by the time he was 35 because he invented some machine that could produce sago in a particular way. I don't know how it works, but he was very wealthy. He owned petrol kiosk. He was a wealthy businessman who was very patriotic. And they said, look here, we need somebody who can think like a businessman and come in and break this housing problem, right? So they brought him in. He worked as chairman, executive chairman of the Housing Development Board for free. He later on, of course, joined the party and became a member, but not before. His job was really to fix the housing problem. And so he went out and he did what businessmen did, which is be very efficient, think of ways to cut costs, and so on and so forth. This was one aspect. In other words, there was a political will to get this done. There was another aspect, which was the legal aspect, which was holding things back. The legal aspect was that, under the British, and then of course when Singapore was part of Malaysia for 2 years, we actually had a constitutional right to property. Now, constitutional right to property, by the way, doesn't mean that if you have a piece of property, no one can take it away from you. It simply means that if the state acquires your property, they must pay you market rate. And they cannot acquire the property for any reason under the sun. They must acquire the property for a public purpose, right? So it's not to acquire a property and then make a profit by selling it to somebody else. It must be for a public park or a school or factories, public housing. They were held back by the law because the law couldn't be changed because of the constitution. And they could only do this in 1965 after Singapore left Malaysia. But in the meantime, they were pushing the contractors, they were pushing everybody to build flats as quickly as they could. And within the first year of the housing board's existence, they had built more flats than the British did in the 40 years before. Right? So they were just doing it. Not very high quality, but very fast. Very fast, and of course you had the other problems of displacement, getting people to move into flats and so on. But I think by and large, people were quite happy to move into these flats because you had modern sanitation, for a start. So this was how they were able to immediately gain the legitimacy of the people because, you didn't have running electricity, you were, bathing by the standpipe. Now I give you your own flat and so on and so forth. And very, very affordable. You could make it affordable because you could get land at sub-market rates. So highly subsidized housing. Continues to be the case today. Of course, the prices have risen. And our young people complain all the time that the prices have risen. In fact, 2 national days ago, the Prime Minister, in his National Day rally speech, actually three National Day rallies ago, he pretended to be a housing agent. He sort of saying, let me assure the young people that you can afford your flat. Let me tell you how you can afford the flat. Then he started, talking as if he were a realtor, right? We thought it was quite funny, but the reality was that if you are a young person, you could still afford to buy a flat and call it your own in Singapore. And that is what has kept their legitimacy. So every time if they feel that the flat prices are going too high and people are beginning to get angry, their legitimacy is pegged to this. So they've got to keep the prices down. So they're in a bit of a dilemma sometimes, because if they push the prices down, then private property prices will come down correspondingly. Then the developers won't be happy. But I can tell you one thing, developers in Singapore are nowhere as powerful as your developers in Hong Kong. Okay? Nowhere. I mean, they have to toe the line. That's why they make much more money in China and Hong Kong. Same guys, by the way, right? Robert Kwok and all these guys. But they have a harder time making money in Singapore. So that is the reality. The young people in Singapore know it becomes almost a right that they should be able to afford a property. And so long as you have a family unit, so it's like husband and wife or parent and child, you can get a subsidized housing. And I tell you what, 80% of us live in, I live in a so-called government housing. 80% of us do. And they are nice and they are comfortable. Maybe I shouldn't say this, but yeah, my flat is 1,600 square feet.
Wow.
HDB. It's among the bigger ones that they build. There are even bigger ones, they're called jumbo flats. Okay? Yeah, the jumbo flats are for 3 generations. So you get a jumbo flat, it goes up to 2,000, sometimes 2,002. 3-generation family, 2 kitchens, that kind of thing. But they don't build them anymore, but they exist, right? Should I tell you how much? I can sell my flat today, market rate, for US Sing dollars, okay lah. Sing dollars about 630,000. So US dollar about 500,000. Hong Kong dollar times, so about 3 million Hong Kong dollars.
Can't buy anything in Hong Kong.
Given you want to know, $3 million would buy you.
I heard.
Okay, buy one car park.
One car park.
Yes, sleep in your car.
Then you have to sleep in your car. Yeah, I mean this is the problem. The reason they were able to do this was they deliberately did what we call the Robin Hood measures in the 1960s. They acquired large chunks of property from rich landowners, redistributed it through public housing, factories, schools, parks. Of course, the rich guys were all very unhappy. But the PAP calculated, rich guys how many votes? Not many. Huh? All these guys were happy with me, how many votes? That's how they worked it out.
I don't think we can sort of boil down Hong Kong's political and social problems down to housing, but it's very tempting to do that because we have a very different story here. Back in the 50s and 60s, when the colonial government tried to deal with housing problem because there was a influx of immigrants in great numbers, and they came to Hong Kong and they had nowhere to live. So they took to the hillside and they built shanty towns. And then the Hong Kong government had to deal with that, and they built the first prototype of public housing. Unfortunately, instead of trying to be reasonable and humane about it, they just did it also as fast as possible. And they actually built public housing that had no kitchen and no toilets even. Just you know, like a small classroom, and you're supposed to live there and lead a normal life. Then they discover that, you know, those public housings are not fit for human consumption, and they try, you know, other ways. But I don't think this problem has been, you know, properly dealt with, and the situation has unfortunately, you know, become worse.
I'm not sure you can boil down a lot of problems to housing. I mean, housing is of course a big headache, because the biggest expenditure in your life probably, I mean, if I were living in Hong Kong, I would buy a car, so the biggest expenditure is house, I mean, obviously, right? In Singapore, it's house and car, if you try and buy a car, but that one, we pay insane prices. But it has to do with ownership and sense of belonging. If I can't even have a chance to own something I can call my own, then I feel very disassociated with this space. It's just a transient space. I come here, it's like a hotel, right? I pay my bills, and then, you know, when things are not going so well, I just up and go. There's no reason why you would want to invest more of your emotions, more of your talent, more of your hard work into a place like this, because you don't feel that it belongs to you. And I think this is really a fundamental thing that, you know, that if you don't address, you will have problems with the society at large. Really.
And we also talk a little bit about, you know, being ethnic Chinese. You know, there is this crazy thing about, you know, Chinese wanting to own, you know, the property. You know, so last weekend, you know, we talked a little bit about that. You know, 14,000 people, you know, trying, you know, put deposit, you know, something like a few hundred flats, which is just, you know, crazy. To talk a little bit more about this, I have to get to my Russian experience. You know, the time when Spotlight Singapore went to Moscow. I had a chance to visit the city for the first time, and I started to talk to taxi drivers there, and they all said, you know, wonderful things about Putin. And now I understand, you know, why Putin, you know, can hold on to power. You know, because what he did was, you know, when Soviet Union gave, you know, free accommodation, you know, to the cadets, you know, the Communist Party members. Then Putin came in. Now, instead of trying to, you know, be capitalist about it, you know, he then did, you know, something which actually calmed the whole country down. You know, that he said, you know, those who stay in those flats could go on staying there, and he didn't talk about, you know, having to buy the property or anything like that. So within a very short time, you know, he made the country feel secure and rooted. Now, can't say the same, you know, about our government. Now, maybe we move on, you know,
Sure.
now, you know, to talk about other things, you know, because you can only talk about this with a very heavy heart and empty pocket. Now, shall we go back to this heritage thing, because we also are going through a phase that we now feel that in Hong Kong we need to call something our own, and we now go and look at, you know, the little the few heritage buildings that we have. I think according to census, the Antiquities and Monuments Office has sort of gazetted, listed something like 1,100 old buildings in Hong Kong that they set out to preserve. The Fringe Club, when we first moved in 33 years ago, the building was in disrepair because for 10 years, the building was not looked after. So when we moved in, the place was leaking all over, and then there were plants, coming down from the roof, and it was just an old building, and nobody had a clear idea of what to do with the building then. And we keep hearing every 2 or 3 months, from next door, the Foreign Correspondents Club. They came over and talked to me and said, Benny, you better look for another another location, because government is going to tear this building down, and they're going to widen up, Wyndham Street so that more cars can go into Central, to create bigger traffic jam. Or they talk about something that they heard somewhere. But then in the course of 33 years, first we became a listed building, grade 3, and then in 2009 we jumped to grade 1, which is during our renovation project. Can you imagine that the project suddenly from a grade 3 building that there's we can do some changes to the building without going through 10 government departments. And then in the middle of that, the project that we first thought could be completed in 18 months took us nearly 7 years to complete. And we completed the first phase, and now we just a few weeks ago or 2 months ago, we started the phase 2 renovation. And now you see the scaffolding outside. What we are planning to do now is to restore the facade of the building, and also fix the windows, replace the new ones with old ones, meaning the old-looking ones. And hopefully, when we complete phase 3, we will have a facade that look pretty much like it was in 1913, and we're also going to illuminate the facade of the building. That was a bit of telling the audience what we're doing. Now, going back to what you talked about yesterday about authenticity, that in order to preserve an old building, what is authentic and what is creating something which was there, but you have another perspective of restoring historical monuments.
Right. Well, authenticity is very important when we talk about heritage, because what we try to do is not to create something that wasn't there. If it's there, we should try and keep it in a way. And of course, the practicalities are that quite often you are not able to keep it in its original condition or for its original usage. Because, for example, this building, if you wanted to keep it in its original usage, you no longer have a dairy depot. You no longer have to bring in ice to store in your vault downstairs. It just doesn't work that way anymore. So you have to find imaginative ways of doing this. And I think many cities around the world, Hong Kong, Singapore, we are all kind of learning from each other. You see you using this as an art space, which led Koh Bao Kun to set up a substation in Singapore using an old disused substation, and so on. So we try to maintain the buildings. Well, here I'm talking purely about built heritage, not intangible. Intangible is much harder, but built heritage, you try to keep it as original or as authentic as possible. And what do I mean by authentic? If a certain part of the building, for example, did not exist previously, you don't go and build something that looks like the old part and pretend that it was originally there. This is what they did with the Raffles Hotel, by the way, in Singapore, which is now owned by the Qataris, no longer belongs to Singapore. It's it's the most famous hotel in Singapore. And actually the original Raffles Hotel was only the front part, but they built a much larger part at the back, and using exactly the same architecture, make it look like, this colonial style. And then everyone thought, wow, this was a magnificent, huge hotel. Actually, that's all fraud, right? Because it's, you might not want to do that. Again, if there are genuine heritage elements, we should try to keep them. And I did tell the story yesterday of one of my early experiences when I first became president. I got wind that the government, or rather the tourism authorities in Singapore, had this grand idea to remove a 1930 beacon. It's nothing fantastic. It's maybe a little taller than this roof, but it was there since 1930. It was a beacon used, it's like a mini lighthouse, right? Nothing fantastic, nothing spectacular to look at, but genuine. It's been there since 1930. They said, oh, we decommissioned it, we no longer need this because there's no more navigation in that part, and we're going to take it down. And, well, you take it down, then you must have some reason for that. They wanted to put a fake rock on it. This was at the time when they were celebrating, the journey of Admiral Cheng Ho, Zheng He, and they had this idea that the Dragon's Tooth Gate, Long Yamen, referred to in the annals, was actually there at that particular spot in Tanjung Balaya in Singapore. So they said, oh, we'll remove this and we'll put the tooth back, right? Now, there was a rock that kind of looked like a tooth, but that had been blown up. It was actually in the middle of the channel. It wasn't on the mainland. It was in the middle of the channel, and it had been blown up by the British to widen the channel. So these guys thought they would attract Chinese tourists by putting a fake rock, right, in place of an original beacon. Right? Here, we didn't need to do much protest because, you see, the authorities involved were tourism board, not very important in the pecking order, right? So if I attack the tourism board, no issue. There will be, which I did. I decided to attack the tourism board in the press, and I said, what is this? Why are we swapping genuine heritage for fake heritage, right? And it's not even part of our heritage, and so on and so forth. Well, we got a very quick reaction. It was published that morning. By 12 o'clock, I was getting calls from the ministry. The permanent secretary was calling me up and saying, what's this nonsense? I said, I don't know. Go ask the tourism board. Right? As far as I'm concerned, the nonsense started by them, not by me. Right? And they said, yeah, okay, we'll get to the bottom of this. By 2 o'clock, I had the director of the tourism board calling me up and saying, I think there's a misunderstanding. So where do you think I should put the rock? I said, I really don't care where you put the rock. Okay, just leave the beacon alone. I don't care whether you have a rock or you don't have a rock, but do not touch the beacon. So he said, you really don't care where we put the rock? So no, I don't care where you put the rock. Just leave the beacon alone. So today there is a rock. Right? It's a fake rock. It's made of fiberglass. It's horrible. Right? And it's this fake heritage that's maybe about 50 meters away from where this beacon. So the beacon now becomes a heritage object. Suddenly the Parks Board thought it's important. So now they put a fence around there so that people won't go and vandalize this beacon. So, life is a bit funny that way. But here is a case where, how can you go and substitute a genuine piece of, a genuine object with a fake one? I mean, what in the world are you doing? This latest one, Ellison Building. We are fighting this battle. This battle just started last year. Old building, nothing too spectacular, but it stands in the way of a underground road tunnel that they want to build. Now, there are many ways of building a tunnel. Well, not that many. There are basically two ways of building a tunnel. One, you can use tunneling machine and you drill, right? The other one is the cheaper but more destructive way. It's called cut and cover. So you cut a big fat hole, you dig as deep as you need, you do everything else, and you cover it back. They wanted to do cut and cover, and the problem with the cut and cover is that you need to cut the building in order to build the installation down below. So they said, don't worry, we'll cut the building. Okay, 1/3 of it, they'll take it down, and then after we finish everything, we'll build it up exactly the same as how it looked like before. It'll be stronger. And we said, no, you don't do that. This is ridiculous. Why can't you find an alternative way? Why must you tear the building down? If absolutely we've explored every single option and you have no choice, right? We are not in the way of progress, right? No choice, then it should be a reinterpreted form. You should not go and pretend that it's the original. You should do something to show that yes, there was an intervention here and there was a reason why this looks a little bit different from the other one. Anyway, the battle's not done. The consultants have apparently submitted the report. I was just badgering them last week to share the report. And so far they said, oh, we will let you know, we will let you know. So, well, when I go back to Singapore, I'll chase them again. But as to whether or not they absolutely need to tear it down. But in essence, the stakeholders said, look here, you don't need to tear this thing down. If you do, why do you need to tear the whole thing down? Because after all, you're only digging the bottom, right? So maybe you can cut the first level and leave the second level alone. Why do you need to take the whole thing down? So here is another example of why we think, look, if you need to change something, don't go around pretending that it was what it used to be. It wasn't. And we have to be faithful to that, truthful to that, right? It's a little bit like modern architecture. I don't particularly like some of the modern architecture, but it is architecture of our time. It is of our time. It is not, to try and build a building now and pretend that it was, the same style as it would have been in the 19th century, I think, is fake, right? Maybe nice, but it's not entirely genuine.
In our last Naked Dialogue, we talk about situations like that, and just to give a different point of view. In fact, many of the European cities, that we now go and visit, many of them have been rebuilt. Case in point, St. Petersburg, because St. Petersburg was, virtually, destroyed during the siege, Second World War. And then after the war, they painstakingly, rebuilt the Summer Palace and nearly every house as it was before. There's other examples, So when we go and visit these cities in Europe, many of us unthinkingly think, we are actually seeing, the real McCoy, the original buildings, but in fact, they're not.
Yeah.
They were built. But the spirit of that is somewhat different. You can't call them fake because they build not just in the spirit of the old thing, but also materially. They would try and be as truthful to the original as possible. Now that is another topic.
No, that's completely a different objective, right? Because the idea of rebuilding many of the European cities was that you wanted to give people a semblance of normalcy, life before the war. And so it's a completely different idea altogether. It's not about heritage, really. It's really about giving you back the city that you remember. You don't remember this mess. You don't remember these bomb holes. You remember, a civilized place that looked like this before the war. And so there's a different purpose altogether. So I'm not critiquing that kind of heritage. It's a kind of slightly different objective. It's a psychological objective.
And bring back to the Fringe Club. During the first phase of our renovation, a few years back, one afternoon, the workers, one of the workers, came to me and said, "Well, you better come and take a look." We were trying to put another performance space in what we now call the underground theatre. The reason why we call it underground is because we actually lower the floor by 1.4 meter. And as we dug down, the worker found out that there's something unusual about it, and we immediately went and checked. From day one, 33 years ago, when we moved into the building, we always suspected that there was an ice vault, where they kept, the ice blocks shipped in from outside of Hong Kong. Where was that? And during that dig down, we discover there's the arch doorway, and immediately we notified the Antiquities and Monuments people. They came and they said, well, this don't seem to be worth looking into, not old enough, or some reason that they gave us. But instead of ignoring that, what we have done is we have now put a steel cover on top of that archway, and because now we don't have enough money to do any more excavation, and so we cover it up, and then we'll save it for another day. But I think the more we know about conservation, the more we feel we have something that we need to keep. It's not just the brick and mortar aspect of it, because we know that it's important to conserve the brick and mortar side of the building. But more importantly, we know that without memories, without stories, this place is just walls and floors and ceiling. So this is something that we have learned, and in this is part of the Learn, Play, Lead program, sponsored by Hong Kong Jockey Club. This program lasts for 2 years, and we want to learn more about the building. So the Learn, Play, Lead actually is something that we have to learn, and then we play with the ideas, and then we try and lead in the sense that we want to raise the awareness of conserving what we have in Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong started a little bit late, even though on the legislation side we actually more advanced than Singapore, as you have pointed out, but Hong Kong didn't have the chance to preserve some of the buildings that we hope that we still have. For instance, we always talk about the General Post Office that was torn down in 1976 when they make way for MTR, and that happened almost overnight. And another case in point is the banking hall of the HSBC. For those of us who are old enough to remember, walking into that hall and seeing the Venetian mosaic, and all that gone, and many of the buildings also gone. But fortunately, Singapore able to preserve many of those. Am I right?
Well, I think to a large extent you're right, but let me just give you some timelines here. I think Hong Kong was earlier than us in the enactment of your Antiquities and Monuments Ordinance. We came a bit later. Our Preservation of Monuments Act came a little bit later. In a way, just like your AMO, we didn't have very much powers that were for enforcement. So there wasn't very much going on insofar as, you could have a monuments board, you can make recommendations and so on. But I think Hong Kong really took off in the beginning of the 2000s, when you started really trying to take a census of your key buildings. So 2000 to 2004, you did 8,800 buildings, out of which you then narrowed down to 1,444 for further study for grading, right? We didn't have that kind of exercise. I actually did sit on the Preservation of Monuments Board in Singapore for about 7 years. This is a government organization, or rather the government statutory board. We were just volunteers. The difference, I think, here is that our planning department is really a lot more powerful than your planning authorities here. We can tell the developers what they can and cannot do. And that made all the difference, right? So we have a lot of debates internally. In other words, in fact, eventually I left the board because I think the chief planner got tired of me because I'm always fighting her in the committee. But nobody sees these fights. These are all inside. And you end up fighting to get the regulators to do a better job. Right? Now, once we can get the regulator to do a better job, everybody falls in line because in the internals, there are no developers represented. The people who are on the board who make these decisions are, academics, people who are involved in engineering, in history, in architecture, professionals, right? You do not have big realty companies inside there. So once we determine what policy is, then the zoning takes place and everybody kind of falls in line. So there is a slight difference there. In that way, we were able to preserve a lot of things. One of the big ironies, of course, was that the best time for keeping old buildings was at the time when we had rent control. This is the irony. I think you also had rent control after the war in Hong Kong, where you're not allowed to charge beyond a certain amount of rent. This meant that nobody had any incentive to invest in the property, to tear it down, to do anything, because no matter what you do, the rent is only so much, and you can't kick the old tenants out. In that sense, right up to the 1970s and 80s, you actually kept a lot of old dwellings, a lot of old houses. Once they lifted rent control, then of course you have rezoned everything, and then you have development taking place, right? So the difference in Singapore is that the zoning and all that took place early on, and the government also couldn't appear too contradictory because they realized in the 1980s that a lot of Singaporeans were just leaving. Brain drain. There are about 400,000 Singaporeans living in Perth, for example, in Australia, still holding the Singapore passport. So you get a lot of brain drain. How do you stop people from brain drain? Why is it that people leave? Well, you can say better opportunities, greener pasture, cheaper house and cars, but in essence, there was a lack of a sense of belonging. So they said, no, we have to emphasize that Singapore is a home, not a hotel. Now, if you push Singapore is home, not hotel, you can't at the same time go around tearing down the home, right? So this is where the government, in a way, was caught by its own rhetoric. And so that was what allowed us to push the government to do things, and keep more things rather than less things.
I wish we had more time. We're down to 10 minutes, so we'd like to do a bit of a Q&A. But before we do that, I'd like to share with the audience, what you told us yesterday about the importance of knowing more than those in authority, because if we believe in certain causes and we believe in fighting for them, then it is important to have knowledge and experience on your side, especially when you deal with technocrats.
Yes.
You can talk a little bit more about.
Okay, very quickly, yes. This came out of course of conversation. What's the difference between dealing with your Hong Kong type of authorities or your and Singapore authorities? In Singapore, there are hardly any politicians around. They call themselves politicians, but they're actually technocrats pretending to be politicians. Okay, look, you're an administrative state. You win the elections. You don't need to be a politician. You need to be a very competent civil servant, really, right? And we got many highly qualified, highly competent civil servants, which means they think in a particular way. They only think by rules. They think by very rational. Don't get emotional. You get emotional, you get nowhere with them. They just keep repeating the same thing to you, which gets you even more emotional. So no point, right? They will just simply say, but according to the law, according to this. This is what they are very good at. So the way we figured to do better is to know more, right? And I think Yu Feng will probably remember how, were you there at the first meeting with LTA? Or it was so embarrassing for them. Because they thought, oh, let's go and convince all these people that this cemetery actually not that important. And anyway, the highway that we're going to punch through the cemetery is going to do very little damage. They knew so little about the cemetery. They knew so little about what they were doing. Because when they showed the map, all of us looked there and said, impossible. Why? Because the road cut through at least 3 gullies. In other words, you can't build a highway that goes up and down, right? You've got to build bridges, right? You look at the thing, then we said, hey, where are your contour lines? Then the silly civil servant tried to bluff us, say, oh, there are no contour lines in this map. Which was the rubbish, right? Because immediately the guys on the ground, they were texting each other, and then somebody came out and said, okay, by the way, ordnance map, reference number, whatever, go look at this map, all the contours are there. Of course, it was terribly embarrassing for them. This is what they fear most, right? So what are they scared of? They don't want to be embarrassed. They all pride themselves at being very good technocrats. So we were able to do a lot because, in a way, we have the intellectual firepower on our side. We did this with the museums as well. The museum was giving us the runaround about some of the things they were doing. They knew so much less about Singapore history than the people on our side. So much so that one of the staff actually came out and said, hey, very embarrassing, you know, that side, your firepower on the other side, too scary, you know. And they are scared because, you know, knowledge is very frightening for them. They think they know and they try to be cleverer than you. You've got to be a little bit cleverer than them. I mean, clever in not the mischievous kind of way, but really knowing your data. And with data, well, it becomes very hard to argue because, you know, they are rational.
Yeah. Knowledge is empowering.
Very.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing. Now we
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a few minutes left, for Q&A, and afterwards maybe we can talk about it over a cup of coffee if you still have time, or you have shopping to do.
No, I have a dinner at 6 o'clock.
I have actually wanted to share in the late 50s, where Princess Margaret rode the highway. When government started to build the highway, it was actually a cemetery before. It was a mosque cemetery. I don't know whether any Hong Kong people know that.
No.
Yeah. So I don't understand the question because in those days, government have the authority just to tell people, residents to move away, and then they acquire the land to build a highway. But today, Hong Kong government seems to have a lot of problem of acquiring and asking people to move. Right? So I don't know whether during all these last 60 years that the law has changed also. And this is what I want to share.
So we may not have time for this, but if you have some time, I'll be interested in your views on Oxley Road. As a heritage person and as a lawyer, I'll just set it up and you can give more details. This is the home of Lee Kuan Yew, and in his will he said he has to demolish it. But obviously there's a heritage issue and there's also a sibling issue.
Now a family issue, yes.
Right.
Yes.
What is your stand on Oxley Road?
Yeah, maybe we'll take one more question and I'll try and respond to that, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. And I just want you just share us with the protection of Hong Kong and Singapore. What about your opinion of the protecting action in the mainland China? Because I know there's a lot of heritage in Beijing, Xi'an, and other cities, but the protection is not that good. And if you can tell me about this.
Well, I will answer that question first because the answer is I don't know. Really, I don't know enough about what is happening in China, but I can tell you that the laws are there. The problem in China is in the implementation of the laws, right? There are very strict laws about removing antiquities and all that, but you still see, ancient things being smuggled out of China. So there's a problem in the implementation, not so much the law. I'll come back to the question Jason asked about 38 Oxley Rise. This is the long-time home of Lee Kuan Yew. It was bought by his father, actually. And he put in his will that well, upon my death and my wife's death, the property should be demolished unless my daughter wishes to stay there, and she can stay there till the end of her life, but it is to be demolished. All right. It's a very old house, very sprawling. Architecturally, nothing particularly unique. There are many examples of this type of houses still around in Singapore. The only thing here was this, right? And it became a big national issue because the Prime Minister's brother and sister accused him of abusing his power by setting up a special committee to look into the heritage merits of the house. And then, you know, of course there was no decision yet, but whether or not in the end they're going to preserve the house. Legally speaking, the whatever you say in your will can always be overridden by the state. That's without a doubt. Without a doubt, of course. I mean, come on, you cannot put in your will, when I die, my son must die with me, right? You can't do that. I mean, no, of course not. The law must override any personal wishes that are contrary to the law. So nothing to do with the, so the good thing is that the rule of law would be enhanced if in fact Lee Kuan Yew's will was not obeyed, if you know what I mean. Of course, you then have to do it the normal way. What was weird for all of us was, why did the Prime Minister need to go and set up some special committee? Because I sat on the committee before called the Preservation of Monuments Board. It's been there since 1979. Every property that is slated or for discussion for monuments goes through this board. Why do you need to set up an alternative committee? You should simply have said, well, like everything else, we send it through the cookie cutter, right? Put it through the board and let the board decide. If the board says worthy of preservation, then hey, we follow the laws of Singapore. Then, you know, good son or not good son, never mind, you follow the laws, right? So that was where the big fracas was. I'm not sure that if I were on the board again today, whether I would say definitely must preserve. I'm not sure. You know, because when you make these decisions, there are a number of parts to this. You may say preserve in whole. In other words, the whole thing is important, or you may preserve only in part, right? This is what we call the footprint. So the most important footprint in that whole house is in the so-called basement, where the People's Action Party was founded, where key decisions about the making of modern Singapore were taken. That part, I think, is historically very important. The rest of it, the toilet, all that, I mean, not important, not that important. So if I were on the board again, I would venture to suggest that I might suggest a limited preservation of only that section, and the rest of it, well, if you want to redevelop, that's fine, you know.
Is there any indication of why he would have wanted it to be pulled down?
Oh yes, he made it very clear. He said that he and his wife, on a visit to India, had gone to visit the house of Nehru, and that he was disgusted by the fact that people were just walking all over his bedroom and all that. And he said, goodness, can imagine if they did this, people would be crawling all over my house. It's a terrible, terrible idea. I mean, I mean, of course, I'm embellishing it a bit. But in essence, he has said that he doesn't like the idea of strangers walking around his house.
Any more questions? No, and then I will invite Fanny to help us to announce another dialogue. Today is a very exciting one, and thank you for coming. And we have another one in December. Fanny, can you tell us more about that?
The title of the Naked Dialogue is Conserve to Subvert. Lawrence Low from Penang, architect, and his one of his achievements is to preserve a house called the Blue Mansion in Penang. You know, for those of you who may have visited or stayed in the Blue Mansion, which he preserved lovingly over 26 years. And in December 9th, which is also a Saturday, he'll come and talk about how in the process of conservation, how do you subvert the process in a positive way. Now, I don't know the details, so please come if you are interested in this, concept of conservation. December 9th.
Okay, then I will leave you guys go. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for